After the ashes of war, did Britain truly swing into a new era of freedom and equality, or were the changes more complex than they seemed? Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 06, Episode 31, where we explore the monumental shifts in British society from 1945 onwards, as detailed in Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition. Our mission today is, well, to unpack these significant social and cultural transformations Britain experienced post-1945. We'll see that while there was clear progress, it was rarely a straightforward path.
Yeah, that's crucial to understand. I mean, some of these changes, like, say, the advancements in women's status, they actually had roots much earlier than 1945. And others, such as large-scale immigration, well, they continue to shape the country even today. The initial impression of post-war Britain, it might be one of a society just becoming more equal and more affluent, but we really need to dig deeper into the nuances to get the full picture.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of the affluent society then. Lowe suggests there was a continuous rise in living standards, across all social classes from 1945 right up to the mid-1970s. That certainly sounds like a new era of widespread prosperity.
It really did feel like that for many people, yes.
Mm.
The data on poverty reduction is, well, it's quite remarkable. For instance, in York, you have these detailed surveys by Seabaum Roundtree. They showed poverty among the working class just plummeting.
Plummeting.
Yeah, from nearly 28% back in 1899 to just 2.8% by 1953.
Wow.
And nationally, Sidney Pollard's figures show abject poverty, which affected maybe 20% of the population in 53, was down to just 2.5% by 1973. So this wasn't just, small steps. It felt like a fundamental shift.
Those numbers are genuinely striking. So
Yeah.
beyond the stats, what were the key ingredients that fueled this newfound affluence? What really reshaped daily life and ushered in this consumer society?
Well, several factors kind of converge. Real wages, for one, they roughly doubled between 1951 and 1974. Yeah. And working hours came down. Many people got a 40-hour week, plus opportunities for overtime. Paid annual holidays, that became the norm too. And on top of that, the new welfare state provided this crucial safety net. Benefits like family allowances, pensions, unemployment support. All this meant more disposable income, and greater security for millions.
And what were the most sort of telling symbols of this consumer boom? What items really captured that spirit of post-war prosperity?
And the motor car was a big one, a powerful symbol. Sales just exploded. And car ownership jumped from, 14% of households in 1951 to over half by 1970.
Over half.
But maybe the single most popular item was the television set. Went from being a real rarity in 45 to, virtually 100% ownership by 1973.
Incredible.
And then there's home ownership. George L. Bernstein, he called its rise no greater social revolution. It went from barely a third of houses being owner-occupied before the war to two-thirds by 1981.
A huge shift.
Absolutely. Plus, just basic housing amenities saw massive improvements. Think about it. In 1945, 40% of houses lacked an indoor loo or bath, and 65% had no hot water.
That's shocking to think about now.
Isn't it? By 1990, these basics were pretty much universal.
So this surge in personal wealth wasn't just about what people could buy. It fundamentally transformed how they spent their time, didn't it? Gave rise to a whole new culture of leisure.
Absolutely. Eating out became, a national pastime, especially with the explosion of Chinese, Indian, Italian, Greek restaurants. The annual holiday also transformed. Domestic resorts like Blackpool, Southend, they had their heyday in the 40s and 50s. But by the 60s, holidays abroad, particularly Spain, they really took off.
Right.
The number of holidays taken by British people literally doubled between 1951 and 1973. And this continental travel even started to affect British food, Arthur Marwick noted fish and chip shops run by Indians or Greeks starting to offer curry or kebabs.
And this picture of widespread improvement wasn't just about material things, was it? Lowe points to major advancements in public health and education, too.
Undeniably. Public health improved, spectacularly after 1948, thanks largely to the new National Health Service, the NHS, providing free treatment. Infant mortality, which is always a stark indicator, dropped dramatically. From 55 per thousand in 1938 down to just 15 per thousand by 1981.
That's huge progress.
It is, mainly due to vaccinations and more births happening in hospitals. Life expectancy rose significantly, too, for both men and women. Medical advances like penicillin, streptomycin, they were tackling major killers, pneumonia, TB. The government also focused on children's welfare, things like free school milk, regular medical checks. And in education, the 1944 Butler Education Act led to thousands more schools, new universities. This really opened doors for working-class children, offering access to higher education and, critically, social mobility.
This all paints a picture of unprecedented social advance, almost a golden age. But that brings up a critical question, doesn't it? Was this progress really universal? Did everyone benefit?
And that's the crucial nuance, exactly. While there was undeniable progress, absolutely, not everyone shared equally in this affluent society. Some benefited much more than others, and some, frankly, hardly at all. And by the early 1980s, with unemployment rising sharply again, that gap between the haves and have-nots, well, it started to widen again.
So if we challenge that notion of a universally equal society, did the gap between rich and poor truly narrow, or was it, again, a bit more complex?
Well, initially there was a clear trend. The wealth distribution did narrow. The wealthiest 5%, who owned over 80% of national wealth in the 1920s, their share fell to about 40% by the mid-70s.
Okay, so some narrowing there.
Yes, in terms of wealth. But income inequality, which is a different measure, that actually got worse in the 1980s. Reports show the top 10% incomes rose by 38% during the 80s, while the bottom 10% saw only a 5% increase, partly down to tax policies under Thatcher and Major, the book suggests. And there was also clear geographic inequality. Prosperity tended to concentrate in the South, while poverty remained entrenched in the old industrial regions, Wales, Scotland, the North.
It sounds like the whole idea of class also started to shift, maybe moving away from those old aristocratic notions towards something more fluid, and this idea of social mobility really came to the fore.
Precisely. Sociologists started using new classifications based more on occupation and income, moving beyond that simple upper, middle, lower model to try and track mobility more accurately. The traditional landowning aristocracy definitely declined in influence. Wealth became the main marker of the upper class, and they were joined by, industrialists, financiers, media types, though elite education Oxbridge remained pretty important for getting top jobs. But between the mid-60s and late 90s, Lowe points to a marked increase in upward mobility, especially into higher professional groups. H. Halsey famously put it, 2 out of every 3 middle-class men today were not born into a middle-class family. Access to university, grants, that was key.
That sounds like a huge amount of social movement.
Mm-hmm.
But was there a counter-argument? Did everyone agree the class system had been completely transformed?
No, not entirely. Critics like Galley argued that while many people moved up, it didn't really break the privileged position of those from public schools in Oxbridge, the established upper and middle classes. And a lot of the upward movement was arguably just down to the changing shape of the economy. Manufacturing jobs shrinking rapidly, service jobs growing. So more of a shift than true class fluidity.
I see.
The working class seemed to be disappearing into the middle class, but it wasn't always a comfortable fit. As Bernstein concluded, class identity is more than just your income, isn't it? It's deeply cultural, too.
And despite all this talk of an affluent society and increased mobility, the problem of poverty didn't just, evaporate.
No, absolutely not. Unemployment went up and down. It was under 300,000 in 1955, but hit 1.6 million by 1978, and then soared much higher in the 1980s under Thatcher. Poverty persisted. It particularly affected the unemployed, especially those with families, the elderly, the sick, disabled people, and women who were separated, divorced, or widowed. Even as late as 1999, a survey showed 16% of the population still living below a minimum standard. So progress, yes, but significant challenges remained.
Let's turn our attention now to the groundbreaking legal and social liberalization that swept Britain, particularly during the 1960s. That era often gets labeled the permissive society.
Yeah, and much of this is often attributed to Roy Jenkins, who was Home Secretary in the Labor government from 64 to 70. Peter Hitchens claimed his reforms had more effect on the way that life is lived in this country than the thoughts of any other post-war politician. High praise or criticism, depending on your view. Conservatives certainly condemned it as the permissive society, but the reforms were undeniably significant.
Okay, so what were the major reforms that came out of this period? Can you walk us through them?
Sure. There were several really key ones. First, the abolition of the death penalty. That was in 1965, then made permanent in 69. There was growing public unease about hanging, especially after some controversial cases. Jenkins called it barbaric and useless.
Even though public opinion wasn't fully behind it.
Interestingly, no. A 1966 survey suggested only about 20% support for abolition, but Parliament pushed it through. Next, the legalization of abortion in 1967. Before this, you had thousands of dangerous backstreet abortions. Films like Alfie even highlighted it. David Steele's bill made abortion legal if 2 doctors agreed it was necessary, medically or psychologically. This was huge for women feeling they could control their own bodies. Then the Sexual Offenses Act of 1967. This decriminalized private consensual sex between men over 21. Homosexuality had been seen as an illness or, morally wrong. This was a massive step. And finally, the Divorce Reform Act of 1969. This removed the need to prove fault like adultery. Divorce could be granted simply for irretrievable breakdown. Followed by the Matrimonial Property Act in 1970, recognizing a wife's contribution, trying to stop women being left destitute after divorce. The aim was to move towards marriage as an equal partnership, though divorce rates did jump pretty dramatically right after.
These legal changes obviously had a profound impact, but how did they and the broader societal shifts specifically affect the status of women?
Well, it's important to remember that even though women had the vote and could stand for parliament much earlier, they still faced, widespread discrimination. Things like unequal pay were standard. In some jobs, like the civil service or teaching, women were actually dismissed if they got married. The emphasis was very much on roles as wives and mothers. There was no real assumption that women had a right to work.
So how did the early campaigns for equality in the workplace start to chip away at these deep-seated inequalities?
In the 40s and 50s, women's movements really focused on equal pay and just fair treatment. Some fields, like university lecturers or MPs, already had equal pay, but not the big employers. Groups like the London and National Society for Women's Service pushed hard. Medical experts helped by, debunking myths about women's efficiency being affected by periods or menopause. Progress was slow, though. The first big win was in 1955. Civil service women finally got equal pay.
And it wasn't just about pay, was it? The actual patterns of women's work started changing quite significantly, too.
They did. The number of women working full-time stayed fairly steady, but part-time work just soared. From under 1 million to over 4 million. That's nearly half the female workforce. More married women started going back to work after having children. Initially, maybe just for the extra income, but later, as Bernstein notes, for independence and a social life outside the home, too.
Right.
And the Ford Dagenham strike in '68, you mentioned it, a sewing machinist paid 85% of men's wages for the same grading. That really brought the issue of equal pay to a head. Barbara Castle had to intervene.
The Dagenham strike is such an iconic moment. This period also saw the rise of a more radical movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, the WLM. How did their demands go beyond just equal pay?
Yeah, influenced by feminist thinkers like Germaine Greer and Kate Millett, these protest groups from the 60s coalesced into the WLM. Their demands became much broader. Yes, equal pay, but also higher wages for poorly paid women, even wages for housewives. They championed sexual freedom, premarital sex, contraception, abortion access, divorce rights, gay and lesbian rights, too. They were deeply critical of male violence, sexism in the media, in institutions. They rejected traditional wife-mother roles and demanded genuine equal opportunities. Some more extreme voices even saw lesbianism as the ultimate freedom from male dominance.
And despite ongoing challenges, the movement did achieve some significant legislative victories.
Absolutely. The Abortion Act and Divorce Reform Act were massive steps, giving women more choice, even if feminists criticized aspects like doctors still holding the power in abortion decisions. The first WLM National Conference in 1970 set out clear demands: equal education, equal pay, free contraception, abortion, nationwide nurseries. Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch in 1970 was a huge catalyst, a sparkling argument for female liberation, as Lowe puts it. This pressure led directly to key laws. The Equal Pay Act, 1970, though it was a bit watered down initially, and then the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975, and another Equal Pay Act. These made pay inequality illegal and banned gender discrimination in employment, promotion, training, and so on. Beyond the law, you saw more women going into higher education, women playing sports like football and rugby, women being ordained as priests, and of course Margaret Thatcher becoming the first female party leader and then PM.
Yet you mentioned challenges remained. Where were the limits most apparent?
Well, despite the laws, winning discrimination cases proved really difficult. Most failed. Informal discrimination, the old boys network perhaps, still made promotion hard for many women. But it's vital not to lose sight of the scale of change. Dominic Sandbrook's quote sums it up well. The expansion of women into work and asserting equal status had a profound effect on the way men saw women and women saw themselves. If we are looking for a genuine revolution, then perhaps this was it.
Let's shift gears now to the era often called the swinging 60s. It's frequently seen as a time of moral relaxation, deeply linked with youth culture. How should we really understand this period?
It's definitely a debated topic. Margaret Thatcher, years later, famously blamed the riots of the 80s on the 1960s fashionable theories and permissive claptrap. But other historians, like Dominic Sandbrook, argue Britain actually changed less dramatically in the 60s than the popular image suggests. The whole permissive society label might be a bit of an overstatement for many people's experiences.
One definite change, though, was the loosening of censorship, wasn't it? How did that play out in films, books, and theater?
Yes, that was noticeable. Before the 60s, controls were pretty tight. The British Board of Film Classification relaxed its rules in '59, allowing films like Room at the Top with an X certificate, leading to the new wave of British cinema. In literature, the Obscene Publications Act of 1959 allowed literary merit as a defense. This led to the famous 1960 trial over D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Ah, yes, the "would you let your wife or servants read it" line from the prosecution.
Exactly. Penguin won, the book became a massive bestseller, and other previously banned works followed. Theater censorship wasn't fully abolished until 1968, though.
And what about sexual freedom itself? Did the combination of legal changes and maybe cultural shifts really usher in a more liberal era?
Well, the legal changes certainly made a difference: abortion, divorce, decriminalizing homosexual acts. And critically, the contraceptive pill became available from the early 60s, then on the NHS in the 70s. This massively reduced the fear of unwanted pregnancy, which likely contributed to more acceptance of casual sex, although the extent is debated. You definitely saw more couples living together before marriage, people marrying later, more children born outside marriage. Feminists saw this as key to ending the sexual double standard. As Bernstein puts it, maybe women did not have to feel guilty about sex anymore, either about wanting it, having it, or liking it.
This was also a time of huge protest movements, right? What were some of the big ones, and did they achieve much?
Absolutely. The late 50s and 60s were buzzing with protest. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, kicked off in '58. Writers, politicians like Michael Foot, Quakers, all incensed by U.S. H-bombers over Britain. CND didn't stop the bomb, but as Andrew Marr said, it was successful in seizing the imagination of millions, and its symbol became globally recognized.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had the New Left emerging, supporting CND, later the anti-Vietnam War movement. Raymond Williams argued for studying popular culture cinema, music leading to cultural studies, or history from the bottom up. The anti-Vietnam War movement really took hold from 1965. The protests in Grosvenor Square in '68, led by Tariq Ali, turned violent, the Battle of Grosvenor Square. Historians mostly agree these protests helped keep Britain out of the war, and student protests flared up in the late '60s, influenced by the U.S. Demands for more student control, modern teaching. Some reforms happened, but maybe less impactful than protests elsewhere.
We've touched on loosening social norms. Did religious practice decline sharply during this supposedly permissive time?
Well, there was a decline in traditional church attendance, but that trend actually started way back after World War I. Attendance roughly halved between 1900 and 1995. There's a debate, though. Was earlier attendance more about social life and respectability than deep belief? Maybe the 10% who were regular churchgoers by 1950 were the true believers.
Interesting point.
Roman Catholic attendance actually increased for a while, partly due to Irish immigrants and Vatican II reforms. Traditional churches were worried, though. The Anglicans introduced new Bibles, prayer books. The ordination of women priests in '94 caused a major split in the Church of England. But overall, the slow decline continued for most denominations. Though you did see growth in alternative Christian churches, like Pentecostal ones, surveys suggested many people still believed in God but weren't keen on organized religion.
Okay, finally, we have to talk about maybe the defining aspect of this era in popular memory, the emergence of youth culture. How did this whole idea of the teenager as a distinct group really take hold?
Many point to 1956 and the arrival of American rock and roll, Bill Haley, Elvis, Little Richard, then British acts like Cliff Richard, Tommy Steele, and of course the Beatles. The BBC was initially quite resistant to this American influence, but commercial radio, ITV, pirate stations like Radio Caroline, they jumped in to meet the demand.
Right.
The key thing was identifying the teenager, that post-war baby boom generation, as a distinct market. As the economy recovered from austerity, these young people actually had disposable income for the first time.
Ah, the economic angle.
Exactly. Older generations were often, well, horrified. Politicians worried about this focus on leisure undermining morals. But the record industry boomed. Eventually, British music itself flourished. Beatles, Stones becoming huge internationally. Music became sort of respectable, even financially successful. The Beatles got MBEs in '65 partly for boosting exports. And youth culture wasn't just music, it was clothes, lifestyle, self-expression. Companies targeted teenagers, fostering that special identity, encouraging spending on fashion, records, hair, transistor radios, coffee bars as meeting places.
So was this a genuine social revolution led by youth? or more of a commercial phenomena, maybe amplified by the media?
Well, historians debate that. Before the 60s, you had working class street gangs, sure, but national service sort of socialized young men. After national service ended in 1960, maybe they could just continue those earlier lifestyles. The media certainly played a huge role, targeting young people with shows like Ready, Steady, Go, but George L. Bernstein argues most young people weren't rebels. The perception came from adults mistaking very visible youth subcultures for all young people. These subcultures were often rebellious, got media attention, and caused adult anxiety.
Okay, so tell us about these subcultures.
Right. You had the Teddy Boys in the 50s, working class, sharp Edwardian style mixed with American Gambler look, rock music, often seen as thugs. Then the famous mods and rockers clashes in the mid-60s. Rockers were more unskilled working class, leather jackets, motorbikes. Mods were often lower middle class, smarter clothes, scooters, Italian fashion. Carnaby Street became the epicenter, Mary Quant's miniskirts. Andrew Marr calls it the beginning of the buy-and-throw-away consumer culture. Late 60s brought the hippie subculture, fueled by LSD and cannabis. Long hair, flower power, peace and love. Quite small, mainly middle class, often involved in political causes. Then, as the economy got tougher from 69, more aggressive subcultures emerged. Skinheads, tough working class, often targeting immigrants or homosexuals, and punk in 1976, a reaction against everything unemployment, consumerism, authority, think the Sex Pistols. Ironically, often developed by middle-class musicians but adopted by working-class youth, the establishment saw it as Britain declining. But punk also played a role in anti-racism movements like Rock Against Racism.
So wrapping up the youth culture point.
The conclusion seems to be it was primarily an economic revolution. As Andrew Marr put it, it pushed aside older Britain for our current democracy of shopping and celebrity. Young people having money to spend was new, and that enabled a huge cultural shift, perhaps more than a social or political one.
Now let's turn to immigration and race relations. Clearly, a very complex, often challenging landscape in Britain, and one that, as you said earlier, didn't just start in 1945.
No, absolutely not. Britain has seen waves of immigration for millennia: Huguenots, Irish laborers, European Jews before the 20th century. And hostility wasn't new either. Pre-1945, immigrants were often blamed for overcrowding, rent rises, taking jobs. The Aliens Acts of 1905 and 1919 tightened entry rules.
So after WWII, Britain needed labor. They recruited displaced persons from Europe. And then the 1948 British Nationality Act opened the door to Commonwealth citizens. How did that play out, and how did the government react as numbers increased?
Right. The post-war labor shortage led to recruiting Poles, Latvians, and others from Europe. Then the 1948 Act allowed all Commonwealth citizens entry. Many West Indians arrived, famously on the MV Empire Windrush, plus Indians, Pakistanis. They came hoping for a better life, often admiring Britain, and filled vital jobs in the NHS, transport, textiles.
Okay.
Immigration averaged about 30,000 a year in the 50s, but doubled in the early 60s, peaking in 61 and 62, partly because people heard restrictions might be coming. And hostility from some sections of the white population did grow, focused on competition for housing and jobs. There were anti-black riots as early as 1948-49, and notoriously in Notting Hill in 1958.
And this led to government restrictions.
Yes. Successive governments brought in tighter controls. First, Macmillan's conservative government passed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962. This limited entry mainly to those with jobs already lined up or special skills. Critics called it racist as it disproportionately affected black workers. Second, Wilson's Labor government, despite opposing the 62 Act initially, actually tightened controls further due to public pressure, like after the controversial Smethwick election in 64. They reduced quotas and specifically acted to keep out Kenyan Asians who held British passports. It was during this time, 1968, that Enoch Powell made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, predicting racial violence and suggesting non-whites be encouraged to leave. Heath sacked him from the shadow cabinet, but Powell got significant support from dockers and others. Keep Britain White was used as a slogan in the 1970 election, a very divisive moment, extremely. Third, Heath's government brought in the 1971 Immigration Act, limiting entry mainly to those with direct UK family ties, making it harder for families to join workers already here. Though humanitarian exceptions were made, like for Ugandan Asians expelled by Idi Amin in 1972. And fourth, Thatcher's governments in the 80s were seen as sympathetic to Powell's views. The 1981 Nationality Act redefined citizenship, making birth in Britain alone insufficient. You needed parental links too. This led to Britain having some of the tightest entry controls in Europe.
So given these restrictions and the Powell speech, what was the reality of race relations like on the ground for new arrivals? Was it really that hostile?
While Britain avoided the scale of violence seen in, say, the U.S. civil rights struggle or South Africa, yes, racism was undeniably widespread and often overt. Refusal to serve non-whites in pubs, denial of jobs, housing discrimination, those no dogs, no colored signs were depressingly common, according to Lowe's. White hostility often increased when there were shortages of jobs or housing. Non-whites frequently felt targeted by police prejudice.
And the restrictions themselves might have worsened things.
Ironically, yes. Lowe suggests the government restrictions reinforce the idea in some people's minds that immigrants were a problem or somehow dangerous. Even some trade unions complained about immigrants taking jobs at lowly pay. The hostility focused heavily on non-white immigrants. European migrants tended to integrate more easily. Black and Asian immigrants often became targets of violence, sometimes called nigger hunting. The Notting Hill riots in '58 were particularly shocking, described by Marr as mob violence of a kind Britain thought it had long left behind, with white youths attacking black people in their homes. Black people started to organize and fight back.
In the face of this prejudice and violence, what did the government try to do to actually foster racial harmony?
Right.
Did they just restrict entry?
No, politicians generally were more sympathetic than large parts of the public. Powell being a notable exception, along with far-right groups like the National Front. Wilson's labor governments introduced three important race relations acts. The 1965 Act set up a race relations board and outlawed discrimination in public places like pubs, but crucially, not in employment or housing initially. It also criminalized inciting disorder. The 1968 Act went further, making discrimination illegal in housing, jobs, and providing services. It set up a Community Relations Commission. And the 1976 Act established the Commission for Racial Equality, CRE, to promote better relations and strengthen the law against inciting racial hatred, though the Army and police were exempt.
How successful were these acts realistically in changing things on the ground?
Well, progress was very slow. The 1980s actually saw things get worse in some ways. Unemployment for non-whites was twice as high as for whites. This fueled frustration and led to major riots in places like Brixton, Liverpool, London, Birmingham in '81 and '85. Asian communities faced persistent harassment, graffiti, vandalism, physical attacks. Many black people felt constantly harassed by the police. Bernie Grant, a prominent black Labor MP, expressed this deep disillusionment in 1993, suggesting some felt they might be better off leaving Britain. The conclusion was that changing deep-seated attitudes would take generations.
But it wasn't all negative.
No, definitely not. Lawrence Black highlights the huge positive impact immigrants have had on writing, sport, music, business. Modern British culture, as he says, is blatantly multicultural. Think of the Notting Hill Carnival, the ubiquity of Italian, Indian, Chinese restaurants. Britain is, as many joke, addicted to curry. That integration and cultural enrichment is also a vital part of the story.
As we reflect on this deep dive into post-1945 Britain, it's just so clear the period was anything but simple, wasn't it? While the country definitely made huge strides in living standards, legal freedoms, women's rights, these changes were often met with real resistance, and new inequalities, new social tensions emerged alongside the progress.
Precisely. That idea of a sort of simple, sweeping liberation for everyone, it's just too simplistic. These shifts were monumental, yes, but deeply nuanced, often contradictory. They were constantly being shaped by the economy, by social attitudes, which change slowly, and by political decisions. It really shows that progress is rarely, a straight line upwards.
It really does make you reconsider that initial question. Did Britain truly swing into a new era of freedom and equality, or were the changes far more complex? We've certainly seen it was a fascinating, often turbulent mix of progress and pushback. This deep dive really reveals a society constantly grappling with its ideals, its aspirations, and, well, its inherited challenges. It leaves you wondering, what echoes of these transformations do you see in Britain today?